Hi everyone, and welcome to the Design VC, the show where design meets business and creativity meets capital. And I'm your host, Andy Budd. Each week I talk to founders, investors and designers about the role design plays in the world of startups. And today I'm joined by John Zeratsky and Knapp, the duo behind Sprint, Make Time and their new book, Click. Before becoming best-selling authors, they were part of the pioneering design team at Google Ventures, where they helped startups solve a whole range of critical problems. Since then, they've gone on to become investors themselves, shaping how startups use design, find focus, get traction, and find growth. And so, thank you both for coming and chatting with me today. How are you?
Thanks, Andy. Doing well. Great to see you. Thank you for having us.
As I said in the intro, I'm really interested in talking to designers, founders, and investors all around the kind of the role design plays in startups. You've obviously, spent a lot of time in that space. You spend a lot of time working together. I was just kind of wondering just about your partnership. Do you remember the first time that you sort of had real chemistry together and the partnership between the two of you was actually going to turn into something, as big as it is today?
I definitely remember meeting John. I don't know if I would say we had chemistry right away because I was like, okay, so the situation is it's like 2012 and I'm working at Google and my job has evolved over the past 2 years from being a product designer working on Gmail and working on what was becoming Google Meet and into this role where I was running design sprints. I'd created this method and I'm just going from team to team and there was so much demand for it that it kind of became my full-time job. But Google was, I was trying to figure out, well, how do you do a full-time job like this over the long, not necessarily the long term, but how do I do this? And Google was being swept by Google Plus. I think that was kind of taking over everything. And I really was not super keen to be working on that full time or really as little as possible. It's not into that. So I got this opportunity to talk to Google Ventures. So my colleague, Braden Kowitz, who's our co-author on Sprint, amazing designer, who I'd worked with on Gmail, and also Michael Margolis, who I'd worked with on Gmail, who'd been my manager when I first joined Google in the Seattle office. And they both were at Google Ventures, and they were like, hey, why don't you come join us and run sprints with these startups? And I thought, man, startups, small time based companies that I've never heard of that have 3 users or whatever, and I'm I'm running sprints on Chrome and Gmail and search. Come on, that doesn't sound fun. And I went to meet the team, and I remember meeting John, and I think he'd fairly recently joined Google Ventures. And this was the first time I'd met him, although by reputation, you'd hear about John at Google because he's just this designer that everybody was like, oh, that guy's amazing. He can do everything. Product designer, great writer, great marketer, great sort of project leader. He just does it all, full stack. Startup background, which is usually at Google at that time. I would say, gosh, somebody has a legit startup background and came in an acquisition, often just head and shoulders above everybody else in terms of thinking about product. And he could write code. He could do everything, and he could do a lot of things that I couldn't do. And I just remember meeting him and feeling really sort of intimidated. I was annoyed because I felt like there's a bit of competition is there a slot there at Google Ventures for me? And so, my first impression was, I was wary of this guy. And then we did a sample project together. Everybody said look, we should see if a design sprint sort of makes sense with startups. We've never done that before. And Jake, we should give you a chance to work with us and give us a chance to work with you, see what that's like. And we did this sprint together with this startup and went to their San Francisco office and just right away I was like, that was when I think, at least for me, the chemistry started. I was like, oh man, this guy's awesome. I really want to work with this guy. And that was huge for me in considering stepping across the threshold from my safe world of the corporation into, it was still the corporation, right? But into the world of startups. John was huge there. And so, anyway, long story, but that's for me, that's the moments.
That's wonderful. And again, John, to have a hype man like Jake kind of like bigging you up like that must be amazing. So I can see why the partnership works really, really well.
It
I'm kind
never
of
gets
curious
old.
though. Like every collaboration has tension. You've been working with other for quite a while now. I'm just kind of wondering, like in the early days, were there any things that you sort of fundamentally disagreed about, particularly around kind of what good design looked like, and like how did you kind of get on the same page together?
It sounds like a fake answer, but not really. Like I I didn't have I had only warm and very generous feelings about Jake when I first met him. So not as self-conscious perhaps, but I agree about this sort of first sparks of chemistry being when we ran that design sprint together. And there was a moment when Jake and I were walking down the street after one of the days of the sprint, and he said something to the effect of, "Did you know this was going to be a perfect project for a design sprint?" And there was just something about that question and that comment where I was like, no, but like it feels like there's some really good alignment here of our approaches. I think that one of the pushes and pulls sort of within our working relationship has always been about the what versus the how. And I think if I can simplify, I tend to represent the what and Jake tends to represent the how. So we have a lot of debates and conversations about, okay, what do these teams really need to figure out? And what are the things that matter to them? And then Jake will sort of volley that ball back over with, well, here's how we might lead them to that, or how we might help them through that. And then maybe I'll say, well, I don't even know if that's necessary. Like, shouldn't they just do it this way? Like, shouldn't we just tell them to do it this way? And then Jake will say, well, no, I think it's actually, that's harder than it sounds if you haven't been through this before. So to the extent that there have been tensions, I think they're along those lines. And I also think that, maybe I'm picking up in your question this assumption or perhaps this notion that we would have started with more growing pains and then gotten easier over time. And I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I think that as we've continued to sort of push ourselves individually and as a team into new different domains, writing multiple books. And, one of our books, has very little to do with the worlds of design and technology, Make Time. And so sort of diving into that world and then starting our own venture fund together, I think we've continued to have, new tests and new challenges and new ways of trying to figure out how to work effectively together.
I mean, I guess one of the reasons I ask is I think, creative partnerships are really, really interesting, and creative tension, I think, is important. You need a little bit of tension. Like if both of you are doing all the same things and you're doing it in the same way, there's very little value in that relationship. Whereas if there are kind of disagreements, or if there are different kind of perspectives or skills you bring, that's really valuable. But it can also, after 15 probably years of working together, it must be something in that region. It's just kind of curious to dig in. But I think it's fantastic that you've gone through, several iterations of working together at Google Ventures, working together, authoring, and now in the VC world. So I'm really in admiration that you guys are still kind of going strong and enjoying it. I guess I wanted to kind of maybe go back just a little bit to those early Google Venture days, because, I guess this might be a little bit like unfair of where startups were back then, but it always felt to me that startups often came from more of an engineering or a business background. And here's a bunch of designers coming in and saying, hey, look, there's this thing we're doing called sprints and it's really important. Like, what was the initial reception like? Were people just so relieved that someone was talking to them about design, or did you really have to kind of, sell them on the idea?
Jake mentioned that Braden and Michael brought him to Google Ventures, and I had joined about 6 months before. I joined in June of 2011. And in those first 6 months before Jake arrived, every project we did was ad hoc. Braden and I often, with Michael, we would go inside a company and we'd help them with product, with marketing, whatever they needed help with. And so in a lot of ways that was not sustainable. It wasn't scalable. We were very effective at it. The two big projects we worked on in those first 6 months were Retail Me Not, which is a coupon website, where we essentially redesigned the most important page on the entire site, which is the page you get to when you search for a store and you see all the coupons that are available. And then the other project that I worked on was Foundation Medicine, which was a genomic cancer diagnostic. So two totally different projects. But by going in, and as you know, as a designer, and designers listening to this will know, like by going in and really understanding what matters to their customers and to the team and what questions they have and what risks, we can often, designers have such great skill sets for this kind of work, prototyping and customer research and, generating new ideas in an unbounded way. Like by bringing those skills into the context of those companies, we could be pretty effective. And so I think that in those cases, it was easy for us to say, don't worry about the fact that we're called designers. Like, let's just figure out what you need and help. And so, when Jake started working with us, then I was really excited because this was an opportunity to take what we were doing, but make it very scalable, make it systematic instead of ad hoc. But, I think that we struggled in the early days. And frankly, I think we still struggle sometimes to figure out the right words to use to describe what it is. And should it even be called a design sprint at all? I mean, it was called that. That's what Jake called it at Google. But if you look back at the early blog posts that Jake wrote, and if you had access to the early drafts of the book, and even the book itself, the title of the book is not Design Sprint, it's Sprint. And so I think that there were always these assumptions about what that meant, what design meant. And depending on the situation, it may be harder or easier for us to explain to teams what we thought that meant and how we could really help them.
I mean, I think design is quite a loaded term often. And I think, for other designers, it makes a lot of sense. There's a bunch of sense making. You're taking a bit of a mess. You're taking ideas like spread across 3 or 4 individuals' minds that are often very, very different, and you're bringing them into the open, you're sketching them down, you're showing them back to people, you're asking them, is this what you mean? And then through a conversation, you kind of get to a shared understanding. A lot of people don't see that as design. A lot of people think design is moving boxes around a screen and making interfaces pretty. And so I can imagine there was probably a lot of resistance, or at least a lot of education that needed, like in the early days, to explain, well, actually, this is a design sprint, but really it's about sense making. And I would argue, and we're jumping well ahead here, but I think a big part of your current book and your current methodology is also that kind of early sense making process, but using kind of, what some people in the industry would call kind of design thinking kind of tools or approaches. But, it's very, very similar to kind of business model canvas in some ways. But I'm kind of wondering, like, was there a project or a company that you both worked on together where this sort of approach really clicked?
Certainly the first design sprints, when we talked about that first one and John saying, we're walking down the street and talking about it, like it was a design sprint, but the structure was different than what we do today. And I think if we looked at it, if we went back and sort of could watch ourselves from a drone floating in the room, we'd be like, oh gosh, guys, that's not the most effective way to do those steps. I'm trying to think of, there was a particular sprint, and I think it was a couple months later where Michael Margolis said, the research partner at Google Ventures said, I think we can actually recruit customers starting at the beginning of the week and test at the end of the week. And that was a big turning point, just in terms of the way it galvanized everything that was going on in the room. We just said, like, look, we're going to be showing this to customers at the end of the week. It created such a heightened sense of attention of like, oh my God, we really have to, yes, we do have to make a decision right now. Okay, there's total clarity, but everything we're doing is about making something that is going to be compelling to the customer.
And in some ways took it away from those simple definitions of design as just being, how it looks, because it was like, it hit people in the gut. It's like, what? It doesn't really matter like how polished the pixels are. Like, it needs to make sense. It needs to work. Yeah. Like that pressure was really helpful.
When I was working in the agency world, we did a week-long design sprint with Virgin Atlantic, the airline, and we had exactly the same experience. We went from idea to working prototype that had customers and was being utilized by sales teams from Virgin, just one or two, within a week. And that was such a transformational experience. Like we were working with internal stakeholders that were used to not seeing that kind of signal for months and months and months, 6 months or a year. And so to go from like an idea to seeing some kind of business signal in 5 days was kind of like transformatory. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why the concept in the book sort of exploded just from the GV world to blogs to agencies to large companies. And I suspect you've spent 10 years of your life going and proselytizing around the process. I'm sure you're probably also bored about talking about design sprints, so I'll move on.
No, not at all. No, I mean we just started Character Labs, which is our accelerator program, and we're doing a design sprint in 2 weeks. I mean we're like, by no means are we sick of this stuff. It's endlessly interesting and still feels very relevant.
I mean, that's a brilliant segue, because what I wanted to ask you is, obviously, you did years of work inside GV. You could have just been comfortable thought leaders. You could have spent your time going on stage, being an advisor, being an author, but you decided to start your own fund, which seems like a really big, challenging, scary process. So what was the kind of motivation for starting Character?
Well, we can talk about the motivation, but we need to talk about the spark that caused us to start it, which did not come from the two of us. It actually came from our co-founder and partner, Eli Blee Goldman, who had spent his career as a VC investor. When he was in college, he met a team from this, basically it was a family office that had been doing VC investing, and he didn't know what he wanted to do in his career, but he was interested in a lot of different things, and something really just clicked for him when he met those guys, and he sort of convinced them to take him on as an intern, and then he worked with them for 10 years, sort of moving up through the ranks and really learning everything that there is to know about venture capital and working with companies, not just in software, but in all different industries, and the earliest of stages all the way through IPO and figuring out when do you sell your shares, and how much do you sort of keep of your position to let it ride versus sell and return money to investors. And I had met Eli just sort of socially after moving back to Wisconsin. So I grew up in Wisconsin. I lived in Chicago and San Francisco for about 15 years, and then moved to Milwaukee, where my wife is from, in 2019. And I met Eli, and we got to become friends, and would meet up for coffee and chat and so forth. And in early 2020, before the pandemic started, Eli and I met to go bowling one day. He loves bowling. And he said, "Hey, Jay-Z, would you ever consider working together? Would you consider starting a fund together?" And so that was really the spark that set the wheels in motion. And I'll say that, I had some latent kind of motivation. I've always been really interested in investing and in finance, and had a great experience at Google Ventures. But one thing that I found, and I want to hear Jake's perspective too, but I found that being a thought leader was actually far from comfortable. And doing the work that I like to do, which is helping teams build new products and bring those to market, you just can't beat doing that as an investor. Like, you can't beat the alignment. You can't beat the relationships that you build with the teams you work with, as a consultant, as a speaker, as a teacher, a trainer. I just found, having dabbled in a lot of those things, it was really hard to find sort of a business model for that work that was better than venture capital. And so when this opportunity presented itself in the form of Eli, that just was really animating to me. And so then, talk to Jake about it, and, long story that we can tell if you want. But yeah, that was kind of the early days of that decision process.
I mean, it sounds like your role in kind of Google Ventures was much more on the sort of operational side of things. You were advising startups, and you found this person that maybe came from more of a GP position, where they had experience of fundraising, they had experience of of shaping portfolios. They had all the kind of the admin and kind of legal stuff. And so bringing you two together, that seems like it was a perfect sort of combination.
That's precisely right. It was like these puzzle pieces that fit together, not only on skills and experiences, but I also distinctly remember when I looked up Eli on LinkedIn for the first time, we had no mutual contacts, which is absolutely unbelievable in this industry. And now we have like 2,000 mutual contacts. So.
I imagine that is really great, because he probably had a whole bunch of, fund and LP kind of, investor contacts. You had a whole bunch of amazing stuff. And so actually joining those two groups together was probably incredibly powerful. One of the things I was actually going to mention, because something you said kind of sparked the reason why I got into venture, which was I came from an agency world, which is probably not too dissimilar to what it was like, in the early days in GV. You almost talked about it like an agency model in terms of going in and just helping companies figure out stuff that they didn't know what they needed yet and kind of delivering services. But with the agency world, the incentives are always misaligned. Like, you were going and working with them, but you were taking money. So there's always a little bit of kind of like, concern from the client as to like, is the advice I'm getting because it's the right thing to do, because they want to charge more? It was always the former, but there's always a kind of a concern with the latter. And the thing I've really loved in the VC world is I'm still doing very similar things. I'm still giving very similar advice. I'm still solving very similar problems. But the incentives are so aligned now. Now when I suggest something, it's not because they think I'm trying to get something out of them. It's because they know that I want them to succeed, because if they succeed, I succeed. And so I love that. And I'm sure that's what your day-to-day is like.
Yeah, this is a huge deal to be aligned with the founders and to be able to say, look, like we clearly want the same things. We just want to be as efficient with your time as possible. And if it's not helpful for you to do a sprint with us right now, let's not do that. I don't want to spend my time doing it if it doesn't help you. I don't want you wasting your time doing it if it doesn't help you. And that's so powerful. There are many things about venture capital that are, maybe annoying or like, even can feel a bit gross sometimes. I think that element of it is the draw, the hook, the thing that works so well. It's such a nice alignment of incentives. And it's, John pointed out to me when first sort of introducing the idea of, hey, what if we start a venture fund with Eli? That, this is the highest leverage way to use what we're good at. It's really the way to do it with the people to whom it matters most, folks who are at the very beginning, starting something new. They can benefit the most from what we're uniquely, weirdly good at. And it's also the way for us to potentially be the most rewarded for that work. And it's not the same. It's a hustle still, but it's not the hustle of, trying to line up consulting clients and it has a different feeling. And that's not to say that, to malign that work, the work of consulting and coaching and advising people at larger companies. But boy, it does feel better because once you get past okay, what are the structures of the deal, and let's sign the term sheet and everything. Once you just get underway with the founders, it's such a nice feeling. We are all in this together, and it gets back to I think one of the sort of themes of my life is I really like building things. I really like to make things, and John will roll his eyes because I always talk about this, but I started off making video games on like a Mac Plus, in middle school and high school. And a lot of, for me, it just goes back to that. It's like, just being one person making the thing from zero to everything, pixel by pixel artwork, writing the code, bug testing it myself, watching my friends use it, try to get it to spread around the school, it's like this tiny market. And that still feels really good. If I'm making something, it still feels really good. And I think I periodically got into situations in my life where I felt like I was making something and more like I was, kind of doing this job for somebody else. And that eventually happened to me at Microsoft, and I wanted to leave. And when I came to Google, I felt like I have a lot more autonomy. It feels like this is a really special moment. We're building new products, and there are very few designers, so the role in the product is really strong. And that kind of shifted. And going to Google Ventures, I think in the early days, we were still trying to establish the brand of Google Ventures. We were still trying to build credibility with founders, and we were also trying to establish this design sprint thing and figure out how it should work and then get the story out about it. And that felt like making a thing. And then that kind of slowed and stopped. And that's around the time I left, around the time John left. I think when we felt like, okay, now we're just sort of sitting back. And the fun thing about Character has been having that sense of building something in the fund itself and trying to figure out how to make it work, but also over and over again, this sense of with the founders, even if it's for moments at a time, that you're fully in with them on building the thing and figuring out that how do we make it work? How do we make something people love? That's so much fun. And it's weird that in what can be this very just, like cutthroat almost business of like, the way venture capital can be, that you can also have this just sort of purity of alignment that's so joyful.
I mean, it's great hearing you say that. I mean, again, it's very much my own personal experience as well. Like, I think one of the reasons I got into VC was also because it's a place where you can have a huge amount of impact. I do a lot of coaching with design leaders, and they often work at much larger companies where the founder has no connection with design and sees design not as a kind of important strategic lever. Whereas I get to work with young founders who, really from the start to build a way of thinking and a way of understanding the world into the company culture. And so that they never have to kind of hire someone like me to come in later to help coach them and their design team because it's already kind of baked in. And so I think the leverage you can have is great. I think also if you're a designer working on 100-person design team, you can feel like a very small part of a big machine. Whereas I think the kind of stuff that we do is really 0 to 1. It's really formative. You are there at the stage that the idea is being formed. You're helping find the route to product market fit because we're both in relatively early stage funds, and so that is really, really exciting. And it's where I think as a designer, thinker, a product person, and maker, you can have the biggest impact. And so I love that you reference that.
There's another layer of making things on top of this that I wanted to just touch on because I think it's sort of unique in the world of VC, and for folks listening who maybe come from a design background and are interested in VC, there's actually a big opportunity to make things inside of your firm and inside of your strategy, the way that you operate as a VC investor. And I think it's an area that's neglected by a lot of VCs. The default mode of being a VC investor is, you have a network, you go to events, maybe you post on LinkedIn or Twitter, and you do deals, and then you make introductions. There's this kind of like circle around the standard things that a lot of VCs do, and we have found that it is both highly rewarding and fun and really effective to think beyond those defaults and to create things like Character Labs, which is our accelerator program, or the Foundation Sprint, which is a new sprint method we created at Character, just like we created the design sprint at Google and Google Ventures, and to really think about what are the products that we can create as investors, because we're selling something to, we're offering something to the market, which is money. We'll invest, cash in your business in exchange for your equity. But if everybody's offering the same product, how do you differentiate the product that we're offering as an investor? And so I think that's a way of looking at VC that is underappreciated, that has become really, really important to us. And it's another way to kind of scratch that itch of like, it's just so fun and so rewarding to make stuff. And it doesn't have to be products, but it can actually be sort of these systems and these processes that really help us be successful as a business.
One of the things I love about being a sort of a former designer in VC, I don't really do much actual design work anymore, but I come from that background, is that you're also helping companies design businesses. So it's not just designing interfaces or products, it's designing the whole kind of way that a company operates. But you're doing that with character, and within character you're spinning out, like you say, these kind of, they might be considered service offerings, or they might be considered sort of products or businesses, and that is really, really fun, using your platform as a tool to kind of grow other things internally. I've always been quite fascinated with the world of the venture studio, which is kind of almost the taking that idea to its kind of like ultimate conclusion, which is, rather than finding people to give money to, we will kind of birth lots of startups, within the company. Like, we will maybe come up with the idea, we will maybe find a CEO to kind of drive it forward. And, I think it's still a market that hasn't quite got traction yet. There are a few companies that do it really well, but a lot of them are kind of, not quite in getting that level of success at the moment. But I'd love to see more people enter that space and really use their own creativity, their own creative capital to, generate, dozens of interesting ideas. But one thing I wanted to sort of move on to really quickly is just, whenever a VC fund starts, most of them have this thing called a thesis. It's their kind of their philosophy, their idea, the thing that kind of differentiates them in the market. Like, did Character have a thesis? And if so, what was it? And what is it?
Basically, no.
Okay.
We did not have a thesis. Well, let me back up. Normally, when people say our thesis as an investor is, our investment thesis, what they are describing is the kind of company that they want to invest in because of a set of beliefs or predictions about how the world works today or how it will work in the future. Mm-hmm. The best in the business at thesis-driven investing is Union Square Ventures. And if you look back, if you go on the Wayback Machine, actually, they may even have this on their website as archives, but if you go on the Wayback Machine and you go to usv.com from, I don't know, let's say 2009 or something, they have a thesis about paraphrasing, essentially democratized media, social media, networked media. Mm-hmm. And it's spelling out, we see all these trends from things like Flickr and Twitter and blogs and podcasts, that the world is going to continue to look this way and expand in this way. And we want to invest in companies that fit into that thesis, that mm-hmm. theme. Mm-hmm. And we didn't have anything like that. I think that as we have grown and continued to invest, we have developed some very lightweight versions of that, which we can talk about if you want. But there's a different kind of thesis, which is really about investment strategy. So it's mm-hmm. not what do we invest in, but how do we invest? Mm-hmm. How do we leverage our advantages, the things that we're uniquely good at, to find great opportunities, to make good decisions, to earn the ability to invest in those companies when we decide that we want to. And that's something that we were very, very deliberate about, and we still are. And it's really at the core of how we operate. And it's essentially about this idea, this assumption that when you're building a startup, the most important thing is to build a product that solves a real problem for customers and figure out how to put that into the world and talk about it in a way that really clicks, that really resonates. It sounds so obvious, but when you look, on Twitter, you read VC blogs, most of the things people are talking about are not that. They're mostly talking about other stuff. They're talking about technology. They're talking about partnerships and pricing models and growth rates and hiring. And all those things are really important, but none of them matter unless you get that first thing right, unless you make the right product for the right customers and you know how to talk about it in the right way. And so we believed, and we still believe, that if we can help startup founders with that specifically, not only can we give them an unfair advantage, but they're going to be attracted to us. They're going to want to work with us because we have created these sprint methods that are used by the world's most successful startups. We have more experience with these than anybody else. And we're able to really clear our calendars and spend time with founders to help them solve those existential problems, those answer those existential questions that they have as they're building a new company.
And I guess that's sort of what I was sort of getting to, really. Like, I think you're right. I mean, I suspect that there are types or classes of business or founder that you like to invest in. And so I think there probably is a kind of a thesis around what makes for a good fit between a company and character. But I also get the sense that you are positioning yourself in the market as offering a belief, a set of skills, a problem-solving mechanism, and people are coming to you because they value that. They probably know your brand, they know your backstory. I imagine, I might be wrong, but I imagine you're maybe doing more follow-on checks than lead checks. Like you might be leading less rounds. So the way you get into those deals, just for the audience, like someone that's leading a round is tending to put a lot more money in, and they're kind of the sort of the anchor investor. But in order to kind of come into that round, you need to be adding value, probably more than just the cash. And I imagine when people look at you, look at your positioning, look at your offering, you're offering so much more than the cash that you can deliver. Like you say, you're helping them figure out some of the real sort of fundamental stuff. And so I guess one of the things I was wondering is, like, do you consider yourself as like a design VC? Like, there are the designer funds, there are other companies that really lean into that. Like, do you see that? Or are you almost distancing yourself from that kind of sort of design label?
I want to let Jake take that question, but I also want to clarify one thing just in case anybody hears this or watches this, and they're interested. We do lead rounds. So we lead and co-lead seed rounds and pre-seed rounds. But most of our investing happens through Character Labs, which is an accelerator program where we are often the first investors into a company. So one thing that's really unique about our approach is that we don't source from other investors and we don't source from other accelerators. So the model that you're describing, which is sort of the value add participating check model, is where somebody says, hey, I have this really unique thing that I do. I'm going to go develop relationships with 50 different VCs. And then I'm going to, basically ask them to pull me into deals, and I'm going to fight my way in. I'm going to win my way into that opportunity. And that's not how we operate. I mean, not to say that we never ever source, opportunities from other VCs, but
you're creating your own deal flow from the sounds of it.
Yeah. So in almost all cases, we have a direct relationship with the founder, either because of the books, or like you said, the brand, or because it's somebody that we worked with maybe 10 years ago at Google Ventures, or it's somebody that we actually kind of went out into the world and we found. We do a lot of outbound sourcing, and oftentimes our books act as a calling card for those. But just in case somebody's listening and they're like, hey, I want to raise money, I want to work with Character, like, we absolutely lead rounds, and we would absolutely love to be, your first investor. You don't have to have your round lined up before you come and talk to us.
Brilliant. Well, that's amazing to know. Thanks for the clarification. That's really helpful. We did sort of touch on design, and I don't know whether you still see yourself as a kind of a design VC. And I guess it might not be a helpful framing, but I'm kind of wondering, like, it feels like design has gone from being a differentiator to, just kind of part of the scenery. Like, and I'm just kind of wondering, like, do you feel that design has become sort of mainstream and accepted in startups? Or are you still having to kind of convince, petition, advocate for some of the things that designers might sort of take for granted?
In my career, it's I know that the need to convince people that design is important is real, and I've seen shades of it, but I have been so lucky and charmed in every situation I've been in. It turns out that design has just intrinsically been valued in the place where I landed. And that started when I was in college. I started working for Oakley, the sunglasses company, and their style may not be what every designer thinks of as like the exactly what they picture when they dream of a design job. But that is a company that really valued design, the way things looked. And so my very first time like working for somebody else doing this kind of work, the CEO, the head of product, they cared about design. And the guy, actually, this like sort of random anecdote, but the guy who he would later become the CEO, and he was their head of design at the time, would come next to my desk, and I was making animated GIFs, banner ads for Yahoo, because this is really like in the time when Google, I don't even know if Google had come out yet. Like Yahoo was the dominant way you looked at the internet, and so they were advertising on these pages on Yahoo where you'd have directories of, you click down to, apparel,
the sunglasses page in the directory.
Yeah, sunglasses page, and they're advertising with a banner ad there. And so I had learned how to make animated GIFs, in high school, and I'm making animated GIFs for this job. And anyway, this guy would come sit next to my desk and put his arm up next to my head, he'd like crouch down, and he'd say, "All right, let's see what you got." And I would flip through the different, if I come up with like 10 different ideas. And he would say, "If the hair on my arm stands up, then we'll use it." So, that's not the way everybody evaluates design, but he cared. They cared about it. And then I went to go work at Microsoft, and at Microsoft I was working on the Encarta team, and I was not a huge like Microsoft enthusiast. I've always been an Apple guy, but I saw this job posting for this job working on the Encarta encyclopedia, and I was like, well, that's actually quite cool. Like, I want to go work on that. And Encarta, they had this history of having a real design-led process. There's this guy named Bill Flora who went on to do the Windows Metro design. He's had this sort of Swiss design approach. All the designers there had a graphic design background. They customized every menu. Everything was this sort of flat Swiss design. And so again, like I land on this team that's been building this product for a decade, and they're super design-oriented. So they're just respecting, at Oakley, I was respected for design. At Microsoft, I'm just sort of instantly respected for design. We go to Google, and there are very few designers at the company, and there was a lot of respect for designers. And you were kind of immediately like a peer of the product managers. There'd be hundreds of engineers, and the engineers are like, "Great, you know how to do design, amazing, like whatever you say," and almost too much though, like whatever you say goes. And then when we came to Google Ventures, it was in this era when the iPhone was really taking off, and that was changing people's expectations for design everywhere. And founders knew that it mattered. They knew they had to do it, and they were so grateful to get our help. And in fact, when I named the design sprint, I mean, I knew it was really about defining the product. The seed of it had come from product definition, but design I knew was like a hook that actually would get people to try this weird idea of clearing your calendar. And the name stuck, but the same is true to this day, that we find when we work with founders. They want design, they know it matters, and they also probably know that we're not, in the purest sense of maybe what everybody would say is like a designer. We're not full stack thinking about, the visual design and the intricacies of design systems and all these things at all times. We're not like super, super hardcore Figma guys or anything. We know a lot of designers, but we're not the folks who are going to connect you with necessarily your first design hire. We might, but we're not like, we're not like the designer fund folks who really are like amazing at all of that. We're not like maybe the traditional design role that folks think of. We're more kind of product folks. And it just happens that our tool for doing the product work, we've called it design for a long time. It has some design elements, but we're almost more like these process dorks. We're going to come in and really think about what's the efficient process we can do together to lead you through decision making. And it happens to be with this angle of design, and we happen to have this product design background. But yeah, I always often, when people ask that question, I have to be honest, like I've just been really lucky. People always wanted it. And I think for both, maybe, I don't know, I don't want to speak for John, but like I think John maybe had some kind of a similar experience before we started working together of situations where design was valued and our work was valued beyond just sort of putting on the finish layer. And I think it has led to a sense when we come to work with people, come to have a conversation with folks, that we're not actually trying to justify or convince them of anything about design. Like we kind of I don't care. I'm not a precious designer. Like I don't care. Like if you don't care about design, it doesn't really matter. What matters is, we're investors. We're on the same page with you. We want the same things. We have the same motivations and incentives. So how do we make your product great? And if it looks terrible, but it's great and people love it. I mean, that was what I was building at Google when we first started, stuff that looked pretty bad, but like was really effective and really helpful and useful. That's awesome. I'm thrilled to have something that's unbeautiful and, undesignery, but it solves the problem People love it. They want it. They want to tell their friends about it. So yeah, anyway, that's kind of how I think about it. And hopefully that kind of sense of, these guys are helpful. They help us solve the problems that keep us up at night is the way we want folks to see us and what we want to deliver for them.
I mean, I guess, what you said sort of resonates. I mean, I do, part of the time I do VC work, part of the time I do coaching design leaders and design teams. And I do see a lot of designers that have a feeling that the rest of the organization doesn't care. But then when I talk to the CEOs, when I talk to the engineering leads, when I talk to the product managers, they do. But there's often a kind of a translation layer that kind of something in the middle is kind of breaking down. And I think, a lot of designers and design teams are fixated on the output. And I think you're clearly fixated on the outcome. You are problem solving. You're walking people through a process in order to, and one of the great things from the design sprint world is you have often a structured way of thinking or approaching problems, which a lot of maybe traditional product people or engineers or whatever don't have. But that structure allows to have really, really good conversations, and the output is almost kind of irrelevant. It's the outcome that's really important. So I kind of love that. So I see that a lot. I also, from my work, I work with a lot of founders. I've very rarely met a founder that doesn't care about this stuff. I meet some founders that come from an engineering background that don't get it, but they often know that they don't get it. And that's why we're having a conversation, because they want that kind of help and assistance. So there's definitely something sort of breaking down there. But that's really good to hear. That's really positive to hear. I think I'm seeing a lot more designers get into the VC world because I think they are helping founders kind of navigate some of those early challenges. But I'm also kind of curious, have you come across many founders who come from a design background? Is that a thing or a trend you're seeing? Like, we've got Figma, we've got Linear, we've got YC saying that we need more design founders. Would you agree? Is this a trend, or do you think it's kind of irrelevant?
I think if we simplify kind of the typical backgrounds of a startup founder, and we say it's an engineer, it's a product person, or it's a designer. Let's just assume for now that those are the three sort of standard backgrounds. That's not entirely true, but I think it's pretty close. I think that certainly engineers are the most common. I think that designers have been gaining on engineers probably, and I think that designers have a really incredible skill set to bring to the job of being a founder, but I don't know if they always have the best temperament to be a founder. There is something that we often see with designer founders where they are, for lack of a better phrase, they're perfectionists, and I say this as somebody who's very detail oriented and does, struggle with perfectionism at times. I think that even though they have, again, a great set of skills that they can use to rapidly, understand their customers and generate ideas and make things and ship those, they often get hung up on wanting it to be just right and wanting to optimize the last 10, 20%, which, especially in a large organization that is working on optimizing mature products, is very important and certainly is a behavior that I think is rewarded. But in a startup, the most important thing to do is to increase the speed of your loop, your learning loop. And that comes by putting things out into the world, by taking action that generates information from the market. And if every time you go through that loop, you're just 20% slower because you wanted to make it just right, you wanted it to be a piece of design, an output of design, to use your word, Andy, that you feel sort of strong, you feel proud of, you feel like it lives up to the capital D label of design, that compounds in a negative way, right? Every single week, you're 20% slower, you're learning 20% less. You're at a big disadvantage compared to an engineer who maybe is less precious about those things and going that much faster. So absolutely. To answer your question, I wouldn't say that we've seen an incredible surge of designer founders. I really think in our portfolio, there's maybe only 10% we sort of would identify as designers. And I'm not convinced that designers are necessarily, better founders than sort of other backgrounds based on what we've seen, at least.
I mean, I think that trend I've seen as well. I've met and talked to a lot of design founders who have said that they've really had to unlearn a whole bunch of skills and behaviors that was really hard. You're being paid to, normally in your day job to put something out that's considered, that every single kind of edge case has been sort of worked on, and you sweated the details, and that's almost the culture. That's the kind of the way you're taught at university, and you look up to these kind of perfect situations, and that just doesn't work necessarily in the early stage startup world. And very quickly you have to kind of get comfortable putting things out that are, maybe 80% there rather than 100%, and that took 20% at the time, rather than kind of, you spent all the extra time kind of sweating the details, because like you say, it's about cycles, about iteration, it's about learning. The other thing I find, and this isn't just with designers, but with product people in general, like we all know this idea of like product market fit. And I tend to find that a lot of product and design people, they want to solve every business problem with the product. They're really drawn to product-led growth. They're really drawn to, like every sales problem, every growth problem ends up being product. And there's a real resistance towards doing some of the things that is really important. Sales, marketing, kind of going and speaking to customers, going and doing outbound, like all of this kind of stuff. And often it takes a bit of a kind of a bunch of failed launches and really slow growth to make people realize, oh, maybe the solution isn't always in the product. The product has to be good, but maybe I need to step up and start doing things that are uncomfortable and out of my comfort zone. And so the designers that I find that lean into founderdom well are the ones that pivot really quickly. And the ones I feel struggle, their head is always in product, even as the kind of the runway's running out and the growth is not taking off, because I think that's their comfort space, that's their happy place.
Yeah, and you touched on the biggest danger that startups face, which is running out of time, running out of money, and having to step away from what they're doing and go to do something else. And when we talked earlier about alignment, Jake spoke about the upside alignment, this notion of us, participating wholeheartedly in helping teams build their companies and sharing in the rewards. But we're also aligned on avoiding the downside, because we don't want them to run out of money before they've, launched anything or reached product market fit, and they don't want to do it either. And so it's great if a designer founder wants to, put in that extra 10% of polish. And certainly in some cases, I think that can lead to success if it creates a better positive impression on customers. But I think when it comes at the cost of runway and of speed, that's where it becomes really a fatal flaw in their approach to building a company.
I think some of the most successful founders who we've worked with, and we have worked with a lot of founders over the course of our time at Character now, which is, we're doing Character for what, 3-4 years?
4.5,
yeah.
Almost 5. Yeah.
Yeah. And now with labs, we're doing, like, our current group of labs has how many companies in it?
19.
19. So we have 19, founders. We get to see all of them, how they behave, how they operate, how they make these decisions. In parallel, and then going back to our time at Google Ventures, I worked with 150 different startups and including some founders who I won't name drop, but famous founders who we got to work up close with, and founders who maybe aren't so famous but were also incredibly successful, and we got to see the early days, how they made decisions. I think that founders who are, whatever their center of gravity is, or their foundation, if their foundation is, as John said, if it's engineering or design or product, to simplify it down to those three things. And we've seen founders who are great, whose center of gravity is sales, but just to simplify it down to those three. Whatever their foundation is, they are intensely curious and have this sort of exploratory approach to the other things. Yep. The product person wants to know about engineering. They want to know about sales. They want to know about design. They want to know about being a founder, which is a whole other thing, right? Like just as John said, this notion of being quick and pivoting and sort of trying to understand how you build this bridge from your vision of the future to like the way things can actually work in reality and what's going on with your customers. And so no matter where they start in terms of their background expertise, the best ones, they really want to know about all of it. They want to care about all of it. And they're not too locked into this sort of sense of like, this is what I do, and I'll just get other people to do that other stuff when I need it, but I can stay here. they're breaking out of any definition of who they are. They benefit from that deep expertise that they have, but their head is in all of it, including that experience of the startup and the different dynamic of how the startup works. If those folks, they don't always succeed, but when you see people succeed, it's usually going to be that they can do that. And with whether designers are more or less suited to do that, I don't know. We see folks who do it well. We have founders in our portfolio who design background. They do that thing really well. They have broken out of that silo with a lot of energy, and that's kind of, I think, what makes it work.
Absolutely. I mean, I love meeting people that just want to understand how the world works. I meet a lot of engineers that they grew up, like they got into engineering because they wanted to take the radio apart or take the clock apart, or, like a lot of scientists, physicists, they want to understand how, the world works, how the universe works, how biology works. And it's that curiosity. And I think you're absolutely right. If you want to be a founder, you have to understand all the different parts. You have to understand how a product works and finding product market fit, but you also have to understand your go-to-market strategy. You also understand how to build a team and build an effective engine for delivering products. You need to understand how to find customers and all these kind of things. And often I think you need to step away from the thing you're really good at, because that will probably take care of itself. And you need to lean into the uncomfortable things that you're not good at, because there's nobody else going to do it for you in the early days. You need to get good at that really quickly. I find a lot of founders who really lean away from sales and want to hire a bunch of salespeople to do the sales job for them. And that invariably fails because those salespeople are not as aware of the founding journey. They're not as invested in the success. And so usually I think the founder ends up having to make that first sales playbook. And once that playbook is there, once they've figured out how it works, then they can bring experienced salespeople on to kind of take over and optimize the machine and grow it. But being that first person to kind of do all those things, I think is really important. I guess I'm curious. So, you've touched on it a little bit. You talked a little bit about Sprint. We all were aware of it. You talked about Make Time. Wonderful book if you're a founder trying to reclaim some bandwidth and some sanity. I think it's an amazing sort of recipe book of ways to kind of figure out how you can calm that kind of, inner sort of monkey mind and be really resourceful and effective, or just really calm. The new book, not so new now, I guess it's kind of 7 or 8 months, out, I'm presuming, is Click. And it starts with this idea. I think it's a foundation sprint. Can you just give me a little bit more of a background of what does the book set out to solve, and how did that come about?
We started Character with this notion that we're going to use design sprints. We know it works. We know people know about it. It's going to become this flywheel for us of both attracting founders and helping us to evaluate founders, because we've been in so many sprints, and helping us close deals with founders and then helping them succeed and hopefully spin out to them wanting to tell other people about us. And we started doing that, and that worked. That worked actually, I think, as almost just as we imagined it. It's almost shocking how usually you have a plan and you have to pivot from that plan, and actually it worked really well. In our course of time at Google Ventures, when we first started at Google Ventures, we were working mostly with pre-seed, seed, some Series A companies. Google Ventures was trying to establish its reputation, and for founders in Silicon Valley, even though Google obviously was at that time everybody loved Google, but if you were a founder, the notion of having Google in your business was maybe people were a little uncertain about that. People were a little uncertain about if Google would commit over the long haul to Google Ventures, or would this be sort of a Google Reader situation where we kind of shut down a thing that some people love. And so our role as design partners, honestly, a big part of it, to be frank, was marketing. Can we convince founders? Can we tell the story about a special kind of help that we offer? Our colleague Braden Kowitz was the first design partner at any venture fund anywhere. And so if we can establish that and kind of make that our thing and follow through and deliver on it, that could be part of what makes, GV legit. And anyway, as Google Ventures' reputation grew and grew, we were able to invest in later stage companies, write bigger checks, deploy more capital, which if you think of it from the Alphabet perspective is what they wanted to do. They wanted to have this really big fund. For me personally, like the most fun, the place where I feel like I'm the most helpful, it's much, much earlier. It's those early stage companies. So we got to character capital. We start running sprints. We're getting to do it again now with pre-seed and seed and occasionally Series A companies. And this is like, this is great. This is the sweet spot. But we noticed something that we had not noticed before. Before we were doing it at Google Ventures, it was our first time. We're learning so much, we're trying to figure out so much. I think we had seen a lot more by the time we had started Character Capital. And we're also in this role now where we're not operating partners, but we're also the GPs. So we're having conversations of a different sort on a different cadence with founders, in addition to being in the room with them during design sprints. Anyway, that's a lot of background. The point is, when we were having conversations with founders, we noticed that sometimes you'd feel like, God, I have to ask this obvious question. I'm almost embarrassed, but like, who's your most important customer, guys? And there might be, 3 co-founders, they're super bright. They've been working with each other. They are obviously focused on the same thing. They obviously have the same sense of what the strategy is, but they have 3 different answers about who the target customer is. Maybe slightly different, maybe actually sometimes sort of shockingly different. Or you say, okay, sorry to ask this, guys. I feel like as the investor, I should know, but would you mind telling me like, who's really like the most important competitor for you guys in your customers' minds? And how do you differentiate? Like what's the thing that really sets you apart for that customer? And, same 60-minute debate, no conclusion. And we realized like, oh God, you know what? This is a problem. People feel like there's a sense of we have the same strategy in mind, but it actually, when you zoom into the details, there are key differences or there's a gap. And that gap, and especially when it comes around this promise of what do we solve for customers and what's the way that we do it that's radically different from anything that's come before, that's a problem. And when we thought back on all of the sprints that we've been in over the years and the ones with the most successful companies, the companies who went on to build these tremendously successful products that customers loved, that, grew into big businesses, they all had in common this same element, which is when they came into the design sprints, they had a very clear idea about what their differentiation was. They knew what problem they were solving for customers, and they had a sense of how to talk about it. It might not have been right. They were open to treating it as like a hypothesis. And as they ran design sprints, they were looking for, okay, is that working? And if it's not working, you'd see in the next design sprint that they shifted the way they approached it. They either tried to sharpen the language, so we're not being clear enough, or they sharpened the approach to the design, we're not delivering it quite right. Or sometimes even, that differentiation isn't it. We need to do this other thing. But that was clear for everybody on the team. It wasn't this vague thing. And we realized we need to help folks get there. We need to help them with that pre-design sprint. So in other words, we're defining the product now, we're defining the marketing now, but we're defining the sales method now. Before we do any of that definition and building and forming of the thing and testing of the thing, we got to know what we're about. We need to have this kernel of a strategy that is so clear and simple that we all understand it and we can assess it when we run sprints. So it's that's the genesis of it. The foundation sprint was, how do we get people on the same page about customer they're after, the problem they're solving, who they're up against, and what differentiates them, what makes them special, and what's the best approach to take, what should we be experimenting on to have the best chance of delivering that differentiation.
And I have to admit, I love it. I think it's a really good book. I've really enjoyed reading it. It resonates so much with a lot of the problems and challenges I see. In fact, literally before this call, I was finishing off my talk for Web Summit in Lisbon in a few days' time. And it's all about that challenge. And so I also, this is a little bit of a personal plug, but my book Over My Shoulder, The Growth Equation, is all about the first couple of years of the founder's journey to product market fit. And literally the first or second chapter is exactly this problem. And I think what you've done is you've basically taken that small little nugget. You hadn't read the book, I don't think, before, but you've basically blown it up into a whole book, a really good guidebook on the importance of ICP, really, really good, definition of who you're serving, really, really good focus on the differentiation and a really good focus on positioning. And these are things that I think most founders get wrong in the early stages, and that bakes problems into the product later on. And so I think if people can read your book, if they can follow that process, if they can have clarity around that, it just means you get to product market fit much quicker. You can get to product market fit in 12 or 18 months rather than 2 or 3 years. And I think you've just really, really sort of simplified the process. And so I can totally see how that would be massively useful to some of your early investments and massively useful to a whole bunch of founders who are out there and struggling. Hat off to you. I think you've done a brilliant job. I know we're kind of at time now. We're sort of just slightly over an hour, so I don't want to hold up any more of your time. I'm sure there are kind of investors, founders that are desperately wanting to speak to you. So, but just to finish up, I'm just kind of curious, you've helped teams move faster, focus better, connect deeper, and obviously, really start their startup journey from a good position. What's next for both of you individually, and what's next for Character?
Good question. I am not yet tired of what we're doing. So plan to keep on going. We spoke briefly about this notion of building new things and optimizing things. And we have been internally at Character, we've been through a tremendous amount of building new things in the last, really the whole time since we started Character, but especially I think the last 18 months where Character Labs has kind of come into its own. We wrote Click, and writing a book. I think writing a book like this one is actually 2 projects in one. You have to write the book, but then you also have to figure out the systems and the methods and the things that you're trying to tell people about in the book. It's not like a journalistic book where you go out and you do reporting and that's the book. We had to sort of tighten up the foundation sprint. How does it work? What are the steps? And then how do we explain it? What are the stories we use to bring it to life?
And also because you're self-published, there's go-to-market and there's kind of promotion. You're doing the whole, the book is almost like a mini startup in its own right. And it seems like things are going really well. So I'm sure there's a lot more time invested in the book. But look, thank you, John, Jake. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks a lot,
Thanks
Andy.
for having us, Andy.
And look, I just want to say to the audience, that was brilliant. I really, really enjoyed that conversation. Thank you, everyone who kind of listened in. Thank you for tuning into the Design VC. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, leave a review, do all that malarkey. If people want to follow what you're doing at the moment, where can they go? Where's the best place to find out all about you guys and Character?
Character.vc.
Brilliant. Simple as that. Well, look, thank you so much. I'm Andy Budd. See you all next time. Goodbye.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.